So welcome everyone. This is the second to last webinar in the winter learning series. I can't believe it. So we're almost at the 3-month mark now. This series is hosted by the Missouri River Bird Observatory, the Missouri Birding Society, and the Conservation Federation of Missouri. And I'd like to give a special shout out to some folks, Patrice Taylor, an MRBO supporter, Edge Wade and the whole board of directors there at the Missouri Birding Society, and the David Risberg Memorial Grant Committee at the Conservation Federation of Missouri. Thank you all so very much for supporting this series. My name is Dana. I am with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Our mission is the conservation of birds and their habitats via science, education, and advocacy. And I am very pleased to introduce our speakers this evening, Katie Lamke and Ray Powers of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They are coming to us live from Lincoln, Nebraska this evening. So Katie and Ray, please go. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks for having us here. So my name is Katie Lamke. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. My main role at Xerces is to oversee our Bumblebee Atlas projects in Nebraska, Missouri, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, and soon expanding into Iowa and up into Minnesota. So quite a big chunk in the Midwest here, and I'm going to let Ray introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Katie. I'm Ray Powers, and I am a partner physician with the Xerces Society and NRCS. So I help private landowners use farm bill programs to put in wildlife habitat. And I focus in Nebraska and South Dakota. And I'm going to give you guys 3 apologies before we even get started. First of all, we will probably hear my dog at some point. We may have a visit from a fluffy cat. And this is the first non-family sitter I've had for my 3.5-year-old. So I'm hoping we aren't disrupted, but if we are, bear with me. I've also been sick, remember the 3.5-year-old. So I will be popping cough drops and I'll try to speak loudly. And finally, my expertise is really sort of the Central Great Plains. So I've tried to caveat a lot of the plant lists and made sure everything was native to Missouri. But a lot of this will be a little bit more Western Missouri appropriate, just kind of based on my own experience. So those are my 3 caveats. And with that, I will pass it back to Katie.
Sounds good. And I always hope for a visit from a big fluffy cat. So if that happens, I'm here for it. So tonight, Ray and I are going to talk about pollinator gardening and conservation. I'm going to start out with the conservation part, and then Ray's going to roll into gardening and what sorts of things we can do around our house to support pollinators. So we both work for the Xerces Society. If you haven't heard of us before, we are a nonprofit science-based organization that works to conserve habitats, invertebrates, and the habitats that support them. And similar to MRBO, we do this through conservation, advocacy, research, and education. So we have people all over the United States, and more recently one in Canada, that have slightly different tasks of what we're doing. Some of us are on the ground working with bees or butterflies or freshwater mussels. Others are focused on pesticides, or they're out in the field with ranchers trying to make more habitat suitable for pollinators. Lots of different things that we're out there doing. And we focus this work on invertebrates because they all play such a vital role in our ecosystem, right? About 95% of Earth's biodiversity is made up from different types of invertebrates. And they all play a role, whether it's decomposition, biocontrol. Today we're going to talk about pollination. Many of these species are the base of a food chain. And recent figures have estimated that there are more than 200 million insects for each human on the planet. So there are a lot of different species out there. Many of them need our help. And as we dive in to just look at pollinators, starting with the plants, right? So bees rely on plants, and 85% of our flowering plants rely on insects. Many of those animals end up being bees, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as these plants are getting their pollen transferred from one flower to another and allowed to reproduce, they're creating these really diverse plant communities that are helping to create resilient ecosystems, which is more important now than ever, with the threat of climate change. So with all of these different types of plants, you can see here's just a graphic here that shows some of our more common prairie plants and how their root systems can vary. But with those long roots, they're more adapt to deal with drought. They can reach their roots way down into the system. They help cycle nutrients in the soil. They help stabilize the soil. They can filter water. And not only are these plants creating a healthy place, but they're also offering food for a wide variety of animals, right? Whether it's the seeds or the fruits or the nuts that they're creating. But they're also going to be providing shelter and nesting habitat for many of our other larger predators. Looking a little bit more at diet, 25% of bird and mammal diets consist of pollinator-produced seeds or fruit. 96% of songbirds end up rearing their young on invertebrates, so that's a lot of young caterpillars out there. And here's an example too, just a single pair of chickadees has to gather around 10,000 caterpillars to raise their chicks. So our main groups of pollinators, there's more than just bees. You can have butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, but bees are often thought of most frequently as the pollinator because they're the most effective. And this is for a few different reasons. And one of them is that they are dependent on flowers, right? So bees are the only insect to consume both nectar and pollen throughout their life cycle. That's the only thing that they're going to be eating. Some of our other insects can rely on wasps or spiders, like they'll eat other insects. But bees are only going to be eating pollen and nectar. So they've adapted these features on their bodies over time that allow them to collect and transport mass amounts of pollen from a flower and back to their nest. So some of these features here, if we look on this bee's hind leg, you can see those are scopal hairs, which are specialized sets of hairs that allow the bee to transport huge amounts of pollens and still continue to fly in a very balanced manner back to its nest. So it's kind of like a brush on the bee's hind leg. Other bees have those hairs, but they're on the underside of their abdomen, so they can better pollinate some different types of flowers that are more open, as we would consider them, right? They can sort of brush their bellies along the flower and pick up the pollen under there, fly it back to their nest. Other bees, like the bumblebees, have a corbicula or a pollen basket. So instead of having that brush on their hind leg, they have more of a hollowed out groove. You can see the shiny area here, and they'll pack that area full of pollen when they're out on their foraging trip before flying back to their nest. And then there's other kinds of bees that will hold nectar internally. So they'll sort of gather some pollen, mix it with some nectar, it becomes this soupy mixture, and when they fly that back to their nest, they'll regurgitate that. So many different ways that bees have adapted to collect and transport pollen, but it's how bees have become the most efficient pollinator, right? They're on a mission to go get this pollen and bring it back. Most of us, when we think about pollinators though, or bees in general, we think of the honeybee, and that's for good reason, right? They are an object of familiarity for us. They're a very important agricultural species. They're a great educational tool. It's fun for a lot of hobbyists to go out and take care of them as pets and make honey. But these are not the natural species here, right? These are non-native species from Europe. They are closer related to cows and chickens, and that humans manage them rather than the wild native bees that are just found in our prairies and in our forests and some of the more natural areas in the state. So when we look at wild bees, there's about 5,000 species native to North America. And in Missouri specific, there's about 450. Although there is a lot of work that's still being done in wild bees. So if we ever do have an exact number, I expect it's going to keep going up. But even from these 5 pictures here, you can see that they are very diverse. So just like bees, or I'm sorry, just like birds, bees can come in all different shapes and colors, and they'll have slight adaptations. And the more that you start looking at them, you'll start noticing that they fall into different groups, just like you have your songbirds and your raptors, like we have different groups for bees as well. So looking at size, on the left, we have a very small cuckoo bee or a parasitic bee. And on the right, we have 2 larger male bumblebees. Most people, if we saw the bee on the left, you wouldn't recognize it because it's so tiny. In the photo there, it's up next to the corner of a dime. And if you did recognize it, you probably wouldn't think that it's a bee, right? It's not black and yellow. It's not very hairy. So different shapes and sizes for bees. They can come in these beautiful colors and have lots of sculpturing. You can see all the pinpricks on this bee's exoskeleton there. This is a small carpenter bee, so this might be a bee that nests in big blue stem or rose stems or raspberry bush stems. Some sort of plant that's got a thick stem with a pithy center. This carpenter bee will chew through that pith and create its nest inside there. There are also these sweat bees. A lot of people have heard of sweat bees. So here's an image of one up close. It's a really dark green metallic color. And there's about 1,600 species of Lasioglossum out there. So this is a very, very big group. Actually, it might not be 1,600. That might be Andrina. Don't quote me on the number there. What we're looking at is they're very beautiful bees, dark green, very diverse. All the little spots that we're seeing on the hind leg there, those are individual pollen grains that this bee has picked up from a flower and was planning to fly back to her nest. And we have bumblebees. These are a group that I work with regularly, basically large flying teddy bears covered in really dense hair because they're fit for cooler climates. And bees also have a variety of diets. So we tend to think about bees as specialists or generalists. So when a bee is presented with, say, this beautiful pollinator restoration here, right? There's a lot of different flowers out there. There are some bees who are going to take advantage of all of those plants out there. But there are others, like the specialist bees, who require a particular pollen in order to reproduce, or that they're going to feed their young. So the specialist bee that I have up there is Sphaestra obliqua, which is a bee that specializes on Asteraceae. So it might use the echinacea out there. What else is in that field? We got Monarda. It probably wouldn't use Monarda for pollen, but it would visit it for, nectar. So there are some bees that are just going to target plants for their pollen. Other ones can use them all. Wild bees are also pretty diverse in their nesting habitat. So again, similar to birds, how you might have cup nests or platform nests or the mud dauber nests, bees also have a variety. We also have mud daubing wasps, so most of our bees are going to be ground nesters. About 70% of them will nest underground, and these tunnels can be, a few centimeters under the surface or up to a meter. Most of them are going to be lined with a waxy secretion. Let's see if I can get a pointer out here. No. Here, can everyone see my mouse? This is a tunnel right here that the bee has excavated. And you can see she's dug out a few different chambers. And within each of these chambers, if we go up here, the cell has been lined with a waxy secretion that sort of protects this small egg right here from fungus, bacteria. It helps seal it off from water, and it really keeps it humidity controlled in there. So the bee will make this little chamber, add some pollen and nectar, lay the egg, seal it off, and then start on another chamber. From the top, it would look something like this, these tiny holes. And if you're lucky, you'll see a little bee popping its head out. So not the easiest thing to see, unless you're out in your garden and you're observing your dirt patches all the time. They're pretty difficult to stumble upon.
Hey, Katie, just so you know, we can't see your mouse, but
Oh, you can't see the mouse.
we can't, but that was very explanatory nonetheless.
Okay, you followed
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Shoot.
The pictures are great.
Okay. Tunnel nests or above ground nesting bees. So the other about 30% of bees that nest above ground will utilize something in the environment to make their nest. So there's bees that use mud, there's bees that use leaf pieces. Some of them will use flower petals that those create really beautiful nests when you find some pinks and purples just inside a stem. Some bees have been known to make their nest inside of snail shells, stems, rotting wood, old beetle holes. Here we can see a leaf cutter bee flying back to its nest with a big piece of leaf. In the bottom right there, you can see the Seratina or the small carpenter bee. You remember that blue bee that I showed earlier? This is one of those bees there excavating a little nest. And then lastly, we have bumblebees. So bumblebees are sort of a different group on their own. These are social bees, while many of our wild bees are considered solitary. So they don't have a colony like we think of with honeybees when there's a queen bee, worker bees, male bees. Most of our wild bees are solitary and just have one female who takes care of everything. Bumblebees, however, are social. So they are going to have a queen, workers, and male bees. And they tend to nest in these pretty messy areas. They're advantageous. They look for somewhere that has some existing insulated material. That could be in a bird nest box. The top picture there was under somebody's horse saddle that they hadn't used in a while. It could be in an old rodent nest. There have been anecdotes of bumblebee tunnels going about 9 feet into the ground, just following an old mouse tunnel. Depending on the species, for bumblebees, a nest can be anywhere from 25 to 400 plus workers. And Ray's going to talk more about nests and sort of how we can provide habitat for these different bees. But just being aware of where they're completing their life cycle is helpful when you're trying to figure out how to garden for them. And so these bees that we've all just talked about are the ones that we need to start thinking about when we're talking about our natural areas and trying to protect pollinators, right? We don't want it to be honeybee focused because those are managed by humans. We're doing a lot to help take care of the honeybees, but it's our wild bees that are really in need of conservation right now. So supplying them with native plants, coming and joining a community science project, these are efforts to help the native wild bees in our area. And as many of us have heard, our pollinators are in decline, right? Many of you are probably here tonight because you want to help the pollinators for one reason or another. You've heard that there's threats going on about them. Here on the screen here, I have the rusty patch bumblebee, which was the first bumblebee that became federally endangered back in 2017. And talking about threats to pollinators, it's not like we can just say there's one thing happening to them, and this is similar if you're aware of threats that are happening with grassland birds. There's quite a different, multitude of factors going on that are causing these declines. And so there's this really nice picture here from the, God, I'm blanking on the name right there on the Wagner. Habitat loss is probably the biggest one leading to declines. Climate change is going to have many effects that, we can make models and come up with our best guesses, but really understanding how dramatic the threats are going to be from climate change is something that I don't think we can even fit inside our brains right now. Pesticide exposure in both urban and agricultural landscapes is threatening the pollinators. Pathogens, parasites, and disease, loss of genetic diversity, as their habitats get smaller and they can't disperse as far, or they're mixing with more of the same individuals, they're losing that diversity that keeps them stronger. And then we also have to deal with introduced and managed species. So honeybees, the competition that they bring in, as well as other managed wild bees. And on top of that, we have to think about the interaction of these threat factors. So just like when we're sick and we still have to work, we know that it's harder to do, right? So if there's a bee out there that is already dealing with a parasite or a disease that is maybe foraging in an area that's been exposed to pesticides, that bee is now dealing with effects of those interactions. So there's a lot of different levels at play here, and deciphering which ones are affecting the bees the most is really hard to do. But we do have some immediate steps that we can be taking to support bees while researchers are figuring out these sorts of questions here. So as I mentioned earlier, habitat loss is one of the biggest threats facing our native pollinators, where we're having these wild natural areas converted into agricultural areas or urban landscapes that have a lot of impervious surfaces. There are a lot of towns and cities making an effort to add more natural spaces to their parks, which is really nice to see, but we probably need to be doing a little bit more of it. Pesticide exposure is also a really big one. So here are 5 different images of how insects, pollinators in particular, can be exposed to pesticides. Right? It doesn't just have to be direct contact. As I mentioned earlier, some of our above ground nesting bees will use things like flower petals or leaf pieces to go out and make their nest. We now know that 70% of bees nest underground. So if the pesticide leaches into the soil, it's probably going to have an effect on the bees. And then we have things like systemic contact. So neonics are probably some of the worst pesticides out there, where the pesticide is absorbed in the roots and then gets expressed in the leaves and in the pollen and then in the nectar and in the flower. So there's a lot of different ways that bees can be exposed to this, and this is happening in large monoculture crop fields, but it's also happening right at home, right? There's a lot of people that use pesticides incorrectly, just from not knowing or not reading the label, or maybe using too much right at home. So just being aware of what's going on in your yard before you just douse it in chemical, really good thing to do. But luckily there are some things that we can each do to support the pollinators, despite everything that is going against them right now. One of those things is the Bring Back the Pollinators pledge that the Xerces has started. And this is just a simple pledge where you say you're going to grow some bee-friendly flowers that are going to bloom from spring to fall to support that entire life cycle. You're going to provide and protect bee nests and caterpillar host plants. You're going to avoid using pesticides, and you're going to share the word. So Xerces has these nice signs on our website, but there are many, many people that have come up with some beautiful creative signs for their own yard. And it's a little bit more fun when you can bust out some paints and add a sign to your own yard and just get your neighbors involved in what you're doing. And the other one that I'm going to talk about before I pass it over to Ray is community science. So in Missouri, we have the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas going, and I saw quite a few names in the participants that I recognize. So thank you all who are already participating in this atlas. It's a collaborative effort to track and conserve Missouri's bumblebees. And the way that it works is people sign up for the project and take a training and then go out and look for bumblebees on their own. And this helps us to understand where Missouri's bumblebees are, like which plants they're using, what habitats they're found in. It gives us an idea of abundance, like how many of the different species are in the state. And it helps us to fill in knowledge gaps regarding their habitat associations. And this is sort of basic information, right, that we're collecting, just knowing where a bee is, what plant it's using, what habitat it's in, what time of year it's out, so that we can start to understand those patterns, so that we can support those patterns. So the way that the project works is the state is divided up into a bunch of different grid cells. Volunteers adopt a grid cell, meaning they are going to survey a particular part of the state, and they sign up and take a training with us. And the cool thing is that these projects are happening in 15 states now. So people all across the United States are participating in the same project. They receive very similar training, and we're collecting data that is not only being applied to the state level, but can be applied nationally, right? We're able to look at this trends from different species at a bigger level. And we have our upcoming training on Saturday, April 15th. If you want to get involved in that, you can head to bumblebeeatlas.org, and we've got information on there about that. After the online trainings, my favorite part of my job is the summertime, where I get to travel around and meet with the volunteers and do some in-person trainings. We talk about how to handle bumblebees and how to photograph them, because the project is all non-lethal, and the way we get away with that is by chilling bumblebees on ice, and it immobilizes them for a few minutes. We can take these really high quality photographs and then identify those photographs instead of killing the bees. So it's a lot of fun to get in the field with people and sort of show them up close and personal what it's like handling a bee and swinging nets. And then all of the data that these people are collecting gets submitted to Bumblebee Watch, which, if you've ever been on eBird, Bumblebee Watch is very similar to that, where you submit your photo observations of a bumblebee. An expert like myself will identify that. You'll get a notification saying, hey, your bee's been identified. And then that data goes on to get used by researchers and scientists that are all trying to help bumblebees in one way or another. And these Atlas projects have really, really been impactful. You can see here in 2018 where that big first spike is. That's when our first Atlas project launched. And each year since then, we have launched an additional Atlas project. And you can see that we are gathering way more observations than a small team of scientists could. So really, really valuable project. It's fun, people like it, and we get to turn the data into conservation tools. So last summer, Ray and I, we did a tour around Nebraska and met with land managers and sort of talked about bumblebee habitat and how to manage for it and how to support it. Some of the hardships that come with putting these plants in the ground, and how do you make that restoration look good? Like it's not as easy as it is, just throwing plants in the ground. So we came up with some management guidance based on some of the things that we found in the Atlas. We made a cool Bumblebees of Nebraska identification guide. The Pacific Northwest has a really nice species summary account. So the data is being used, and we're excited for these projects to continue to grow as well. And more recently, Xerces has launched a Firefly Atlas. So if you want to get involved with fireflies, you can go to fireflyatlas.org. You can learn about flash patterns, some of the different species in your state. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ray.
Okay, I got another computer. I'm hoping my audio is a little bit better. If you all can give me feedback on that in the next couple of minutes, I'll try to manage these two computers and get my screen going. And there's some really good questions, Katie.
Yep, Ray, it does sound better. Sounds great.
Thank you, Dana.
Yeah, yep.
All right. You guys seeing my screen?
Yep, looks
All good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Katie. I am really excited for the Firefly Atlas. Yeah, and honestly, the Bumblebee Atlas also is so fun. It's addicting. I'm sure if many of you are birders, you understand once you get started, it's hard to stop. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through some more practical applications about pollinator habitat, and going to kind of start with the big one here, protect existing habitat. So really being motivated and aware of what's going on in your community and with your conservation organizations in whatever state or place you're in is the highest quality way to protect pollinator habitat. I'm going to talk a lot about how we can create habitat in urban and suburban and other spaces that we use. But the truth is that there are some obligate pollinator species that really need these wide open spaces, really need these sort of prairie endemic species that just don't do well in more disturbed landscapes. So making sure that first and foremost, we're keeping what we've got is sort of priority number one. And then just thinking about our landscapes in the United States, just such a small percentage is really reserved for wildlife. And so trying to fit habitat into places that right now, or they're not really getting used, they're getting mowed a lot, they're not serving as habitat for our wildlife. Where can we fit into that? Whether that's on farms, on our roadsides, in our parks, and the one that we'll dive into quite a bit more over the next little bit, in our yards and gardens. Oh gosh, and I didn't turn my camera on. That's all right. You all don't need to see my face. So really, we need everybody on board for this effort. You know, Katie talked a lot about these declines, and that really is an echo of all of our previous decades of land use in this country and globally. I really love this image. I like to think of those circles as sort of flight paths for some of our more mobile pollinators, some of our bumblebees or butterflies that are able to move further distances to get to different resources. And thinking about how different places within your block, within your city, can provide for pollinators, and how do we make those places happen? And thinking about just the wide diversity of plants and spaces that can be used to support pollinators. So, you know, it's not only those meadow species that we know and love, it's also having some places of undisturbed bare ground for our ground nesting bees. It's having some standing plant litter for our bumblebees or other bees. It's fruit trees and flowering shrubs. It's our vegetable and herb gardens. You know, those are all providing resources for pollinators. So the great news is that small spaces can support pollinators. When you think about the vast majority of our bees and many of our other pollinator species, their entire world might be you're in your neighbor's yard. You know, that's all that they're going to be traveling throughout their life. So if you can provide those spaces and places for them, you really can provide for their entire life cycle. Gardens provide, you know, both floral and nesting resources, as well as host plants for butterfly and moth reproduction. We know that wild bees can be abundant and diverse in cities and urban gardens. For example, one research found about a third of the bee species known in Munich were found just in some flower strips that were 1 year old. We've seen that bumblebee species are supported in both suburban and urban areas at pretty equal levels. And even some species of concern, like the Western bumblebee, can be found in cities and towns. So the main takeaway here is we really can make a difference with the spaces that we have. And I think the best way to do that is to get rid of your lawn. Lawn grass is the largest irrigated crop in the country. It is the most acres of irrigated land. It's for grass that nothing really eats. We don't use it for anything. We waste our time and money fertilizing it and mowing it. And really it could be serving a lot more purposes. And it is also pretty commonly one of the top land uses for pesticide applications. It gets a lot of pesticide applications. And finally, just, you know, another nail in the coffin, many of the lawn species that we use are non-native species that are now invading into our native plant ecosystems and removing habitat even in those wild spaces. So kill your lawn, down with the lawn. And we've got this nice sort of food web or food circles. You know, if you've got really well manicured lawns are typically 1 or 2 species of plants. and you're maybe supporting 1 or 2 leaf-eating insects, maybe a few more species, and then maybe another layer above that that are preying on those, grasshoppers. But it's a pretty simple food web. When we increase the diversity in our spaces by adding flowering plant species and native grasses and sedges, we really diversify that web of interactions that we see in our spaces. So you can see that we're supporting a lot more species. We've added birds to the big circle. So I hope that should just, win you all over right there. Katie mentioned how important insects are to birds. I read recently that there's 310 species in North America that prey extensively on caterpillars, 310 species of birds. Most of our terrestrial birds rely on insects for different phases of their life. So if you care about birds, you really, really care about insects and the plants that support those insects. So you're all here tonight. I don't have to win you over too much, I hope. So let's talk about those different habitat needs for pollinators. So whatever scale we're at, pollinators really need 3 things. They need food, and for most of our pollinators, that's nectar, pollen, and host plants. They need shelter. They need undisturbed nest sites and overwintering sites. And finally, they need a safe haven from pesticides. So they need places where they're not getting continual exposure to pesticides. And really the best way to provide many of those habitat needs is to prioritize our use of native plants. These insects evolved with these plants. They need these plants to survive. And the truth is that native plants support greater numbers of pollinator species. And they also, native plants have evolved together in plant communities, and in the conditions that we are having on the ground. And they can achieve a lot of conservation goals, and they can reduce your water use and fertilization, as well as provide erosion control and just beauty for your landscape. We know that our native trees and shrubs are also critically important and support a lot more biomass of caterpillars, which we know are really important. If you haven't read, I think it was the Narango study, they looked in Washington, D.C. at really diverse landscapes, but they were more formal landscapes that had a large number of non-native plants. It was over 200 species of non-native plants. But even with that diversity of plants on the landscape, Carolina chickadees could not fledge their young if there was less than 70% native plants. So those 200 non-native plants only supported about 30% of what the Carolina chickadees needed to fledge. Another thing that's really important is thinking about having those overlapping bloom times from spring to fall. So some of our pollinators are out pretty early, March, April, May, and they're out and about doing their entire life cycle in just a number of weeks. So they really rely on those early blooming species. And that kind of cascades through the season with different species emerging through the season, as well as some of our more generalists, like our bumblebees that have a longer lifespan, but they also need sort of those early flowers all the way through to the late. So when you're in your yard or you're on your landscape, ideally you want to see 3 to 5 different species of blooming plants at any given time. And buying straight natives is the safest bet when it comes to native species. Some of those varietals can provide some of the more structural or aesthetic things that you might be looking for, but we don't have really strong data sets on how those interact with the benefits that they provide to pollinators and other insects. They have looked at some cultivars or nativars and seen, similar benefits, and others not so much. So really it's just safest to go with a straight native when you can find it. In particular, things that are double petal really don't provide any nectar or pollen. They've eliminated those sources. Additionally, not on this slide, looking for plants that are neonic free or pesticide free is also really helpful as you're putting those onto your landscape and hoping to feed the bees. You don't want to feed them pollen that's got a systemic neonic present in the pollen or nectar. And then also being mindful about your plant selection and providing host plants for our moths and butterflies. So in that caterpillar phase, they need particular plant materials. We all know now the monarch butterfly needs milkweeds in its caterpillar phase, but just looking at the diversity of butterflies and moths and providing those host plants that match up to the species. So some of the places I go for that information are here. So the Eco-Regional Revegetation Application, or ERA, is a Fed Highways application that Xerces helped develop. It's a little bit clunky, and you can kind of filter by your region and download that information, and then there will just be a mass of columns that has all the information, including host plants for each plant species. There will be listed what we know of the moth and butterfly species that are supported by that plant species. Also, Bomona, or Butterflies and Moths of North America, is another place that you can look. It's a little bit more user-friendly, and you can search by the butterfly or moth species instead of the plant species, but you can also filter by region or state. So those are two really wonderful resources. And then thinking about those nesting and overwintering sites. So Katie mentioned that some of our bees are nesting in stems. Often our moths and our moths and butterflies are on our leaf materials or plant materials. And we also have those ground nesting species. So thinking about leaving your stems up in the winter, leaving undisturbed areas in your yard, and having them through the entire winter. I'm happy to see bare ground patches in my yard. I know a lot of people would be unhappy to see patches of bare ground in their yard, but that really, having that access to that bare ground is critically important for some bee species. And some of the things that we typically do in landscaping, like putting down a weed barrier or plastic mulch or wood mulch, can really restrict access to that bare ground. On the flip side, sometimes like pebbles or really light rock mulch can be good for some bee species. So, if that's something that you're looking for, that ground coverage, that might be an option. Picking plants that have pithy or hollow stems. So those caneberries, sumacs, joe pye weed, coneflowers, hyssop, sunflowers, and roses are all great plants for stem nesting bees. And leaving those stalks intact over the winter. I actually usually cut my stalks in the fall to usually over 12 inches. And then I leave them. I don't ever cut them more than that. When spring rolls around, they stay up throughout the next season. And then those bees will be using those stems in the following growing season. They like the cut stems. And they do break down through time. So you don't need to really cut them any further. I also really love a wood pile, and a lot of insects will use, rotting wood, stumps, and logs. They love that. A lot of birds also use that habitat. So when and where you can, leaving snags and leaving logs in your landscape and telling your neighbors why you're doing that is really helpful. And like Katie mentioned, bumblebees are kind of gross in their nesting habits. They like messy places. They like rock piles and brush piles. They like unmown areas, places that don't get mowed. And so just being okay with a little chaos, a little bit of mess in your yard, and being comfortable communicating that when people approach you about it is really important. And finally, leaving the leaves. So yeah, a lot of our beetles, butterflies, and moths are overwintering in or on that leaf material. So when you haul those leaves off of your landscape, you're removing your butterflies and you're removing your moths for the next year. So if you want grass and you want to keep grass, grass can tolerate a thin layer of leaves. But I know, in places with a lot of landscaping trees, you get more than a thin layer of leaves and it will kill that grass off. So moving those leaves into a compost pile or into your sort of more landscaped areas of your yard, but leaving them intact is really great. And also avoiding shredding them. Artificial nest sites. So bees and other pollinators will use artificial nest sites. The conservation value of these places are unknown, and they can be detrimental because they tend to get dirty and they tend to host a lot of parasites and fungi and diseases. So making sure you're cleaning those nests is really important, cleaning those nest cells annually, using kind of smaller nests as opposed to the really big bee hotels and replacing them every few years, not amassing them in one spot where it's really easy for them to get predated on, kind of spreading them out in the landscape. They are a really nice educational tool. They're really fun to watch when you get bees nesting in them. So we don't discourage artificial nest sites, but that upkeep is critically important. Yeah, and as Katie said, you really want to do a sign, get a sign up. This is one of our older pollinator habitat signs. We also have a leave the leaf sign, which I really appreciate for my neighborhood, which every leaf is removed from my surrounding yards. So I appreciate that I'm able to hang a leave the leaf sign. We also have an initiative called Bee City. If you want to work with your community to put some of these practices into action in your city landscaping. And just really recognizing that most insects are not pests. And many insects are providing pest control for us. So when we get rid of all the bugs, we get rid of our friends and enemies alike. And that new influx of pest species may be worse because they don't have their natural predators any longer in the landscape. So really thinking about a threshold for plant damage before you do any spraying. When you've got holes in your leaves and your petals on your flowers, that means that something is using them. And that to me is a sign that I'm successful. So, I think one of the one of the tenets that someone told me was walk 10 steps back. If you can't see the damage from 10 steps away, you don't need to worry about it. And really eliminating or reducing pesticide sprays as much as possible. All right, I'm going to run through some plants, getting low on time. Go through some of my favorite plants for landscaping for pollinators. Again, a little bit further west, probably favored for you guys, but all of these are also native in Missouri. For early, especially really early spring bloom, trees and shrubs are just really important. They are our earliest bloomers, and they also put out a real profusion of blooms, where many of our more meadow early bloomers are, larger single flowers because of the temps. But our trees and shrubs really rock this time period. So things like June berries, red buds, cherries and plums, willows, really any species of native willow is really important for most of our earliest bee species. And nanny berries. And I will get these slides to Dana to share with you all so that you're able to look at these different plant species. Moving a little bit later in the spring to more of our meadow-based species, there really are a lot of native plants that fill these needs. Anemone species, some of our milkweeds are early bloomers. They're indigos, like white indigo. Pink poppy mallow is a great one. I really like mock vervains. They're a nice purple bloom. Some people consider them to be a little bit weedy, but I think they're gorgeous. Of course, our beautiful penstemons that are early bloomers. Phlox and spiderworts are another really nice spring bloom filler. As we're rolling into the high heat of summer, this is a little bit easier time period to fulfill when it comes to blooms. So there's a lot of things on this list. Thistles definitely is a standout one for me. Also really love rattlesnake master, and I find it attracts a lot of solitary wasps, which is cool. Our mountain mints are the same in that they attract a lot of wasps as opposed to bees. Vervains are another just all around favorite of pollinators, as well as wild bergamot. And I put ground cherries on the list because they are tasty and delicious, as well as nice resources for bumblebees. And you can see that a lot of these summertime favorites are going to be then providing seed resources for birds later in the year. Like that top photo in the middle is a figwort, and those capsules are filled with little seeds. And there's a wasp on the rattlesnake master over on one side. Just lovely. Finally, moving into fall, sunflowers and goldenrods that we all love, asters, wing stem is an outstanding pollinator plant. Some of our bone sets, and pitcher or lyre leaf sage is another late season bloomer I always look for. And someone mentioned that they had pollinator habitat in the shade, and that they often don't see that sort of represented in these talks. And I absolutely agree. You can definitely do pollinator habitat in the shade. And this is just a small sample of native wildflowers that work in shade conditions. So it's absolutely doable to do this in the shade or a little bit wetter spots. I also like to use annuals and biennials, and I usually sprinkle those if I'm plugging, I'll put annual biennial seed down between where I've been plugging. And this is usually things that are a little bit more disturbance tolerance. It's usually pretty cheap seed, so you can afford to use seed, as well as some short-lived perennials that establish well from seed. Self-heal, which is what the picture is I think one of the great underappreciated yard plants. It's got a pretty short stature. It's got gorgeous blooms, and it sort of reseeds itself throughout my yard. And so I wrote, don't forget native grasses and sedges, but really these are going to be the bulk of what you want to put into your landscape. These are going to fill the matrix of space that you're planting, and then you'll be kind of sprinkling the wildflowers among these native plants. So for most urban and suburban places, we're thinking about some of those shorter species, like little blue stem, prairie dropseed, tall dropseed, June grass. But really, I think far and away, the one that I've seen the most success with in urban and suburban places are our sedges. There's such a wide variety of native sedges, and they're really tolerant and adaptable to a lot of conditions. So the ones I've listed are a few that are pretty widely available as plants and seed, and do really well in sort of urban and suburban landscapes. Things like Virginia wild rye and broom sedge are a couple other options. The wild rye will also tolerate some shade, and most of the sedges will also tolerate shade. But I'm also a huge proponent of using those leggy, taller grasses because I think they're beautiful. So if you're feeling brave and want to put these in your landscape, I'm 100% behind you. Indian grass is probably one of my favorite plant species, and I think they can have a place in our yards. And Canada wild rye is a really nice one as an early fill-in, especially if you're planting something from seed to sort of suppress some of those weeds. All right, really quickly, we'll run through kind of how to start. And I am able to stay on a bit longer for questions. I apologize, this has gone over a bit. And this is also a little bit place specific, so it might be different in Missouri, but my first step with my yard was really to eliminate herbicide, to stop using my irrigation system, and to mow less. So for me, this is mowing every 2 weeks or less in the heat of the season. For one thing, my Kentucky bluegrass, which is sort of the matrix of my current yard, doesn't grow so much in the summer heat, so I can get away with it. And it also allows other things to sort of flourish and fill in that space. So the primary kind of colonizer in yards in Lincoln, Nebraska, when you don't spray it out, is violets. And it's a native violet. It's Viola ceraria, just common wood violet, I think is the name. And it blooms, it's gorgeous. It's got blue and purple blooms, and it does get insect visitors. So I just don't understand why it's something we spray out. Also got dandelions and white clover coming up. I didn't seed any of these things. Speedwell comes up, henbit, as well as ground ivy or creeping Charlie, which can be a bully and you do sometimes need to control. My take on that is, it's better than Kentucky bluegrass. It's got a bloom. Bees will visit it. And it's got sort of a charming smell. So if you're just going to have fescue yard or Kentucky bluegrass yard, creeping Charlie's not worse than that. You can do better, but you can also do worse. So starting small is how I always encourage people to start small so that you can really learn the plants that you're working with. It can also be really expensive. If a lot of the native landscapers that I hear from want to see a plant every square foot or less. So if you're plugging, they want to plant 12-foot center, and that can get expensive pretty fast. You also are going to need to be doing some weeding in those establishment years. And also you might add seed. But you can continue to build on that. And a great way to do that is to collect seed from your landscape and grow your own plants if you've got the capability to do that. And eventually, maybe you'll get to something like this. I would love for my yard to look like that eventually. So some local plant resources, again, not from Missouri, but you've got a great Grow Native resource guide that I've got linked here. It seems like a lot of you are tuned into a lot of these resources. I was really impressed by that website. Also, you've got a really active Native Plant Society. So I encourage you to visit your Native Plant Society and become a member. Here are some of my favorite internet plant resources. That ERA tool, it's awesome. I love it. So that always comes out high on my list. And that it also has columns for, sort of workhorse pollinator plants, yes or no. It also gives a pollinator value that's based on the pollen and nectar resources, if it's a host plant. It tells if bats visit it. It's just got so much information on it. The USDA plants database is probably the most up-to-date when it comes to nomenclature, and it's where I go to make sure I'm using the right scientific name. And it does have a characteristics for a lot of plant species that has quite a bit of detail. And it will be getting better in the near future, with some input from Xerces. So stay tuned on that. Prairie Moon Nursery is a nursery out of Minnesota. That was a pretty early native nursery. And they've got plant species specific information on germination. That's really nice. You guys have the Missouri Botanical Gardens right in your state. So definitely go visit there. But also the website is really useful and has a lot of details about landscape, kind of using the plants in landscape that I don't find on other websites. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is a great resource, as well as Audubon Plants for Birds. Finally, Xerces has a ton of resources available on our website. So go there. We don't do this work in isolation. So just thank you to all of the people who support our work. And we are a member-based organization. So become a member to support our work moving forward. And with that, I will take a look at questions, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see you guys.
Can we see you all, or is it, there's Katie, I think, and there's Ray. All right, cool, really good.
I didn't want to stop trying to turn it on.
So I did, just so the folks in the audience know, there were some questions that were put in the Q&A that Ray or Katie answered later. If you don't feel that that question was in fact addressed, please, put it back in the Q&A or the chat. But I think in most of those cases, y'all already answered them. I know that you both can see the Q&A, right? So where would you like to begin? We have a number of different questions. Some of them are closely related. So for example, Anne and Brenda both asked if you can kind of repeat what you said about chickadees fledging young. And since Carolina chickadees need more than 70% native plants, where are they getting their food in neighborhoods that have not achieved those numbers, or the birds just not there? What happens?
Yeah. Sorry,
Go ahead.
I read this one.
I was actually curious about your thoughts on that, Dana. So the fact was that a pair of chickadees has to find about 10,000 caterpillars to raise their chicks. Where they're finding them in neighborhoods that don't necessarily have high insects. Have you thought about that, Dana, and what the birds might be doing?
I've thought about it for sure. And as many people on here probably have also gotten a lot of info from Doug Talmy, right? I would suspect that either they're there in far less dense numbers. Some of their food may be coming from like in suburban neighborhoods. I guess I'm thinking of particularly from oaks, that our oak trees are probably going to be more common than, say, pollinator friendly yards. Or the one I don't want to say is that they're not successfully nesting that much, basically. So they might start a nest and not be able to find enough food and fledge none or many fewer young than they would have fledged otherwise.
I don't know a cheap source of self-fill seeds in Missouri. Hamilton Native Outpost might have it. They're usually good for a lot of seeds. I know Prairie Legacy is a seed company here in Nebraska, and they usually have those self-fill seeds and plants.
There are a couple of questions regarding disturbance of ground nesting bees. So someone asks, how do we, is there a good way to recognize where they are? And if I know where they are, should I try to avoid digging there? And then someone, Joseph, also asks, like, landscapers today decided to blow all the leaf litter from the grounds in my community. What impact? So just disruption of native ground nesting and overwintering bees in general. How much can they take?
Well, the one about recognizing ground nesting bees and trying to avoid digging there, the best way to do that is just to spend time in your yard. Sorry if you can hear my cat screaming. So while you're out there, maybe you're starting to plan your spring garden and what you want to do. If you see bees flying around the area when they're near their nest, they'll often sort of hover close to the ground and sort of crawl around and find their hole. So if you see that kind of behavior, I would just leave a radius of space around that and allow the bees to do their thing, and you can plant around that and everyone will be happy. Leaf blowers, depending on the time of the year, I think they can survive it. If it's warm enough, if there's not another frost coming, there's a good chance that the insect could make it. If they blow the leaves away and we get some more cold weather or some rain, or maybe there's not enough vegetation growing yet, there's a good chance that that insect will get eaten or freeze or won't make it.
This is a very good question. What recommendations do you have for those who live in neighborhoods where you can't let your front yard become a pollinated garden due to neighborhood restrictions, etc.?
Yeah, I think a good resource for that is Monarch Gardens, who's a native landscaper. His name is Benjamin Vogt, and he's got a whole blog on dealing specifically with an HOA. And how to sort of address that. But I totally understand the pushback. I think, there's a couple great things. One, if you've got a backyard, your backyard. Another great idea is container plants. So many native plants do fine in containers, and you can overwinter them. They will need some protection. So if you have a shed or garage where you can bring them in over the winter. And then I do recommend getting them water every few weeks through that winter period if they're in your shed or garage, because they're not getting that moisture from the environment. And then, just having sort of parceled out places that are really clearly tended and cared for. So if you've got kind of a border you can put in, you're keeping it short, you're keeping these sort of waves of plants that are really clearly a designed space can also be really helpful and still provide for a ton of wildlife.
Folks, there are some good resources that people are putting in the chat. Some of them have been on Ray and Katie's slides, and some of them have not. So if you can take a look at the chat, please do. Otherwise, we will send a follow-up email with a lot of these resources. And as Ray mentioned, slides as well, which is really awesome. I was actually going to ask that myself. So Jesse asked about hollow stems. An invasive bush honeysuckle has a hollow stem, wondering if we could salvage and repurpose those stems for annual pollinator hotels. There was one other question as well about the timing, I believe, of putting up an insect hotel and what, you know, how effective you all think that that might be.
I'm not sure which honeysuckle that species would be. And I think it would depend on the size of the stem, right, Katie? Anything to add there?
Small carpenter bees will nest in, I know of at least 2 species of honeysuckle. I don't know about bush honeysuckle in particular. You could definitely try and repurpose those stems. In Nebraska, I know people that have used Phragmites, which is an invasive reed. You know, they just go cut it down and it's hollow and pithy, and they turn it into like a bushel, tie some string around it, hang it up in their yard. And it's either an educational activity, a learning thing for their kids or their neighbors. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but you're getting rid of the non-native plant and maybe providing habitat. So you could try it. Let us know how it goes. Putting up a bee hotel, you want to do that before the bees come out. So once it starts getting warm and it starts feeling like spring, so probably a couple weeks from now, I would put my bee hotel out. As far as cleaning the bee hotel, I think I saw that too. If you missed that from Ray's slide, it's kind of tricky of when you want to clean it out, because some bees are going to overwinter in those, so they're not going to emerge from that block until the following spring. Some of them might not be overwintering that if they overwinter as an adult somewhere. So in that case, I think it would be better to put up a new block the following spring, let your old one sort of empty out naturally, and note it. Like, you're gonna have to pay attention to it and notice when the holes that were plugged are now open. And then I would clean it out. You could use a power washer, you can clean it out with some soap, let it dry, you can reuse it again the next year.
There's a nice comment in the chat about Joseph lives in an HOA and collaborated with another resident to create a guide for container pollinator gardening and then shared it with the board and the community. That's a great suggestion.
Yeah, chat is bringing me hope. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good chat.
Yeah.
So Kristen asks, not sure I caught the info about drought resistant plants. Are most native plants adequate? I live in Texas and I noticed we also had Illinois, Indiana, and some other places. So this is really cool.
Yeah. So most native plants are adapted to live in their place without sort of human intervention. I think the caveats there are that you might be living in a place where the soil has been pretty disturbed or changed. So kind of making sure you're matching with your soil type with your native plants. I think the other caveat there is climate change and having more intense droughts happening and more intense heat. And that's when I don't think we've answered yet of, do we need to be looking south for native plants that are more heat tolerant for some of our places. Yeah, as of now, I really use what's local. So that's where I'm at as a plant ecologist. So, yeah.
I think this is a really good question. What is the issue with sprinkler systems? So Ray, you mentioned that was one of the first things I think you said you did when you were like renovating your yard.
Yep. Yeah. So those non-native sod species need our intervention to succeed and thrive in many places, and eliminating some of those supports that are holding it up can help to weaken and stress those, sod species. So I think if you've got a sprinkler system and you are converting to native, that can be really helpful in the first year or two, especially if it's a dry year, to use that irrigation system to kind of help as those plants establish. They're not as stress tolerant when they're just getting going. But in the long run, my goal would be to not use that excess water for my landscaping unless it's, a sort of absurd year of drought.
JL wants to know what the plant on the very first slide was. Very first slide, pink or purple plant.
I believe it was Joe Pie weed.
Does applying something like liquid fence for deer bother pollinators?
I don't know what liquid fence is. Dan, do you know, or no, is it Dan? Who asked that?
Gail in the chat there, Gail White.
Is it just like I don't know what kind of deterrent it is. Rotten eggs.
Dan, are you suggesting to put rotten eggs instead of liquid fence? That's a question I've not heard before. I would assume it depends on what is in it, right? And how repellent or toxic potentially it might be to pollinators.
Yeah.
Good question.
That would be how to get to the bottom of that question, but I don't know that we have data on that.
It looks like there's just a couple more, if y'all don't mind. What would be a good replacement for barberry when it is used as a home protection device?
Barberry. Okay. I would go with Missouri gooseberry because it's very pokey. And if you could plant them in a row in a line, I don't know if that's the the correct thread, but that's what comes to mind for me.
And Betsy asks, how about pussy willows, non-native, but attract amazing number of insects early?
Pussy willows are native in Nebraska, aren't they? What is the species? Give me just a minute.
I feel like I always see pussy willows, but the bees aren't out yet.
It might be a non-native pussy willow. But I thought pussy willow was native. There's definitely a native called pussy willow.
So this is a common name versus potential scientific name situation, isn't it?
Oh, I'm thinking of pussy toes, I think, the small grassland plant that looks like a cotton ball.
So I'm seeing that there some of the smaller salix species, which some are native.
Yeah, I would say if you're seeing pollinators visiting, whether it's native or non-native, that's a resource they're using on the landscape. It just might not fulfill all of those habitat needs. It might not be a host plant for a whole lot of native insects. It might be used, primarily by more generalist visitors, if it's a non-native, but that early in the season, yeah, I don't know. I'll have to look into pussy willow a little bit more to see what species that actually refers to.
And I think since we've sort of like combined and curated a bunch of questions, I think we have just one more. And Dan asks, I think Missouri Bumblebee Atlas is changing their focus this year. Could Katie comment on whether there will be new training for that focus?
There will be new training for that focus. We are still putting the final touches on what that focus will be, but there will be new training for it. It's going to be the same protocol as the last 3 years. We're just going to have a targeted focus on looking for 4 particular species.
All right, I think we're good, right? You both can see, I think, all the things that I'm seeing.
Yeah, looks like
Good.
it.
This was really wonderful.
Well, you got lots of thanks in the chat, and I certainly thank you both very, very much for doing this with us. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight.
Yeah.
So,
Enjoy the rest of
Thank you.
all right, we'll talk to you later.